Welcome to the very first episode of the Backbone Australia podcast. Today we're joined by Dr. George Kailis. Dr. Kailis is an expert in fisheries management with over 3 decades of experience. We have a great conversation about fisheries management, which is especially important given the WA government's recent demersal fishing reforms. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Backbone Australia podcast. We're here today with Dr. George Kailis, who has very kindly joined us to discuss fisheries management and science in Western Australia. George, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation to join your podcast, and especially here in the offices of the Mankell Economic Education Foundation.
Certainly. So to start, Dr. Kailis, could you please tell us about yourself and your family history?
Certainly. So I have a PhD in management policy and fisheries research and law, in particular looking in the rights of recreational fishers in Australia, as well as rights of other fishers in Australia. I've also been involved in public policy and fisheries management for over 30 years.
Wonderful. And what about your family history in the state? What could you tell us? Because obviously you come from the Kailis family, which is quite well known here in the state.
Yes, so the Kailis family is very well known in the fishing world. Our family business was founded by my father in the early 1960s. It's a big family, so I'm not George Kailis, the restaurateur, or George Kailis, the pilot, or any other number of George Kailises. But we've been invested in the fishing industry for an extended period. We're going to talk about a number of fisheries in Western Australia. I just should point out that as of 3 years ago, our family decided to sell a lot of our interest in Western Australia, largely because we don't have that next generation coming through. And so we took the opportunity to sell out. And so I don't actually have a financial interest in the fisheries we're going to talk about here in Western Australia, but we're still involved in the fishing industry in other states.
All right, that's good to know. Obviously, as you've alluded to, the main reason we're speaking here today is because the Western Australian government has recently announced some major reforms to the demersal fishing sector here in the state. And to start, I was wondering if you could tell us, why do you think the government has enacted these restrictions?
Look, the crisis is real, but it's overstated for some fisheries. The government has unfortunately taken effectively a sledgehammer to WA fisheries to address the problems that we do have. With a sledgehammer approach, collateral damage is inevitable, and it is significant in this case. The damage is not, however, random. The government has used the opportunity to advance positions promoted by recreation and conservation lobbies. The result is inevitably a move away from science to position-based management. And that's what I'd like to discuss with you, with the bring out the examples from what's happening in Western Australia and also what's happened in the past. And look, it's a crisis for many in Western Australia, the commercial fishers, tackle shops. It's for people with accommodation in regional towns where there will be no longer any recreational fishing except from the shore, so no boat-based recreational fisheries for much of the coast of Western Australia. And so this is a very significant change, and for many it will be a shock. You can always say the government signals some aspects of it, but not every commercial fisherman spends all of their time reading the tea leaves of the political winds and fortunes that was cast around by political winds, I suppose, a better way, mixing up metaphors there. And so for most of them, I would say this was a complete shock to them. They knew something was afoot, but their expectations were built on the past practice of good science-based fisheries management rather than position-based management, which is certainly part of the elements that the government has proposed and enacted for Western Australia. And look, I've had personal history here. Back in the 1980s, there was a crisis in the Exmouth Gulf prawn fishery. We learnt about it as a family, and my father and mother were involved in the business at that stage from the front page of the Sunday Times. It was a complete shock to us. Plus the heading was excessive and suggested the whole fishery had been closed down. In reality, part of the fishery needed to be closed down, other parts could operate, but all that nuance got lost in the political maelstrom that surrounded that. It often happens in fisheries management, unfortunately, that there's a change in the science, and that change in the science needs change in the management. In that case, a very astute and able scientist called Dr. Jim Penn realised that there were aspects of the Exmouth Gulf prawn fishery which were different to almost every other prawn fishery in the world, and for that reason it needed to be managed in a different way. And so, but this was all a shock, and honestly, when sometimes you're so shocked, you're not listening to people because you put in that defence, protect mode. And I think some people in West Australia are still in that mode, and it's understandable. And I said, I've seen it before in my own family. That was a very difficult time for us because people think, oh, well, that will happen a little bit in the future. And so, no, our creditors started ringing us up immediately. On Sunday night and Monday morning, creditors started suggesting that they may no longer offer us credit. Our bank rang us up, of course, on Monday morning, probably actually rang us up on Sunday, as far as I know, Monday morning, and questioned whether they would continue to provide us facilities. So we could have gone bust on Monday morning. And there will be some fishers who will be in that same position now, commercial fishers I'm talking about here. And the same will happen if you, for example, just recently bought a tackle shop in a regional town, you'd be wondering where your future is going to be. And typically government does promise some compensation, not always to commercial fishers, but has promised to some commercial fishers. But that takes time. And you've got to set up the systems and the processes. That takes 6 months to a year. What do people do in that 6 months to a year when they were being prepared to fish on the 1st of January?
Getting back to the state issue at hand right now, what do you think these policies that the government's brought in mean for fisheries management going forward?
Look, first I just get a little bit more on the crisis, because it is a real crisis for some fisheries in Western Australia. And there's been ongoing government failure for over a decade in tackling overfishing in the metropolitan Midwest and Gascoyne fisheries. Where action has been taken, it was too slow or too late, and the nature of fisheries management is that long-lived species such as dhufish are especially vulnerable to fishing pressure. Now, I'm going to make some critical comments below on actions taken that I believe are unnecessary or misguided, but to be clear, action in protecting stocks as dhufish were overdue and government action was absolutely necessary. And the Minister Jarvis and Premier Cook did take action in those areas, and I applaud them for it. It's easy to criticise when I'm not the Minister or not the Premier, and this has upset a number of people, especially across the recreational lobby as well as the commercial fishers. But actions were necessary, and the problem, as I said, is the collateral damage done to other fisheries where different action would have been appropriate, and effectively the actions are pandering to conservation and recreational lobbies in those cases. But we shouldn't overlook the fact there was a crisis which needed some government action. But merely because of a crisis needing some government action doesn't mean that any government action is advisable. And I'm reminded of the very famous comment by Rahm Emanuel, who, when he was working for, was mayor of Chicago and working in senior areas of the US government, and he said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I do feel there's an element of that here, whereas aspects which are truly in crisis were used to then advance other interests that the government may have. So you've asked the question, what these policies mean for fisheries management then? So the unfortunate fact is that just as political action was delayed for many years, taking a political action in addition to what was required to run the crisis ends up in fisheries management becoming political. And that's my concern here. For some commercial fisheries have a statutory management plan, harvest strategies, written agreements, memorandums of understanding with government, regular meetings which are minuted, and have been through a number of specific science-based reviews independently of the fishery. And the government had in the past also sought extra advice on the models that were being used for those fisheries. These long-lived fisheries are really hard to model because they're so long-lived. They're exceptionally difficult, and so getting the best science involved there. Look, fish stocks very up and down, but the heading by the Premier in his press release that the actions would protect severely depleted fish stocks from extinction. Look, this is certainly not the case in the Pilbara fishery or the Kimberley fisheries. I've seen the research reports from September 2025, where there was what we call ecological risk assessment. And yes, they said that further action was required in relation to red emperor stocks, but there'd already been action taken for the previous 18 months and further action was being foreshadowed. It's no real sense from reading that red emperor in the Pilbara was likely to suffer extinction. In fact, there's a 3,000 square kilometre of the Pilbara where effectively no fishing takes place for red emperor and other stocks. So there's already very significant areas protecting it from all forms of commercial fishing. So it's a bit much then to put that in that sort of a headline. And as I said, it's this framing of it. It's all about crisis. It's all about, therefore, X must happen, that I think is unfortunate for the fisheries, and in particular, those not associated with dhufish and some other fisheries in WA. Even there, I don't think extinction was ever a likely result. Extinction is exceedingly rare for marine species, even in grossly overpopulated and overfished areas of the world. Unfortunately, what happens is you get it down to a certain level where it doesn't recover, or would only recover for a very, very long time. And famously, cod stocks off the northeast of America and Canada are usually pointed to when people talk about this. But it doesn't mean cod has disappeared, but they just haven't returned as you would have hoped. And for that reason, as I said, you've got to take action. But you look at the Pilbara, for example, as I said, trawling was also closed, despite it covering around only 2% of the bioregion was trawled, and extensive areas, as I mentioned, banned from commercial activity, and also that fishery did not target red emperor anyway. They were the 6th or 7th most frequently caught fish in that fishery. So there were already methods in place. So now we've created a fishery in crisis where we needed a fishery that needed more management to better recover. And so you've got the heavy hand instead of the guiding hand of the state. And when it's the heavy hand, then, as John, you understand from your own professional background, the heavy hand of the state is easily swayed by lobby groups and other interests because they seek government to get their objectives. That's their job. If you're a professional lobbyist for recreational fishing and the conservation lobby, your job is to try to use situations like this to advance your group's interests. I don't criticise them on a moral basis for doing so, but it's unfortunate that we're moving away from a science base for those activities. I should also just say a little bit what I mean by science-based, because it's often misunderstood. Science-based does not mean there's a random paper by one scientist which has been peer-reviewed. It's a strong consensus of science in relation to elements. That's why we do go through processes like the ecological risk assessments. We did say that red emperor stocks were severe, but you've got to look at it in the context of that assessment, and therefore it needed a recovery plan. It didn't say it's severe, and therefore it needed much heavier-handed activities. So science is always difficult, but it's always finding that consensus in relation to that and using the best available science. And then the state often does, as it did in the Pilbara, then also get modellers from CSIRO, Dr. Andre Punt. He's one of the top modellers in Australia, possibly the world, and he reviewed some of their models when they were reviewing the fishery. So this is how it goes normally, and that generates through a harvest strategy what your recovery plan is. That's all transparent processes. Fishers are in the room, and the fishers need to be in the room, not as a lobby group, but they also hold specific expertise in relation to that fishery, because sometimes the models assumptions need to be tested against actual real-life people involved in the fishery. Otherwise, there's the danger of them going off track with all the best intentions. So usually these things are pretty transparent, and the fishers usually know well before an action is taken, what the likely actions are going to be, so they can build it into what they do rather than get it in a press release from the Premier. And as I said, my own experience is there's nothing more dispiriting and traumatic to you as finding it out in the paper from a press release from the Premier. Then you've got to say, okay, well, what next for fisheries management? So it was political inaction which caused this crisis over a 10, 12-year period, especially dhufish stocks. I personally have refused to eat dhufish for more than, I think, 15 years, because about 15 years ago, I believed that was inconsistent with mine and our family's ethos in relation to sustainability to be eating a fish that I knew was not being sustainably fished. So this is, as I said, this is not a new, no one's surprised in the academic or science-based communities about dhufish stocks. Unfortunately, the remedy here is corrosive of long-term management processes. Now, I hope I haven't bored you and the audience out there how those processes work through harvest strategies, plans, and all this modelling, 5-year ecological risk assessments, 2-year reviews. All of that is part of the process in relation to commercial fisheries management in particular. And political action, which also involves reallocation of one sector to another, is a key problem here. So the difference when we had the MG Kailis group had the interest in Exmouth Gulf prawn fishery is that at least the government didn't take our licences away and said, well, when the fishery comes back, we may allocate them to other people. Here, in a number of the cases, or both commercial and recreational fisheries, fishing is banned, but only recreational fisheries will be allowed in the future. So this is a reallocation from one sector to the other, which is inconsistent with government policy for over 20 years. And reason why it's so corrosive is that it undermines joint incentives for lobby groups to work together. When we're all in the one boat and we all know that the future of this fishery is to our joint benefit, then lobby groups work very differently when you could overfish and you know that the end result is you will get all of the fishery, or believe that you will get all of the fishery. The government's recent preferred consultation is very much getting lobby groups together, and it's a bit unclear how they're going to work their future consultation arrangements. In relation to this, they had a Fishing Futures Forum, but the same thing is, you just get all the lobbyists together rather than the fishers who fish in the fishery, the researchers who work with them, then get that independently assessed so that there isn't capture of the researchers by the fishermen, or arguably the fishers sometimes claim they've been captured by the researchers, not researchers by the fishers, and made more conservative than they would otherwise be. So, look, this danger of mixing reallocation under political pressure, there was actually a report by a former High Court Judge, John Toohey, on what they called integrated fisheries management back in 2002. And then he said real concerns when you have these reallocations and pressures at a local level, that and I'm quoting here, political considerations at a local level may exert significant pressure on the decision-making process and impede objective decision-making. Now, don't sound all that strong. Do you realise that John Toohey is an ex-High Court judge, and when judges say those sort of words, they actually mean a lot more than we would in a colloquial sense, which basically says the system can't survive if it's there about lobbying groups trying to get more of the resource for their group's particular interest. And I count conservation as a lobby group there because they have interests, even though interests are different in kind than commercial fishing and different in kind from recreational fishing. And once again, I don't want to say I'm not against recreational fishing. I said my PhD was on the public right to fish. I go back to pre-Norman conquest England, track it all through. I come up with some novel arguments, I believe it, I wrote it, that why the public right to fish is important to keep in public policy terms in relation to fisheries management, but also general management of the oceans. So I don't have a problem with recreational fishing, but when you get these formal lobbies, the job of a lobbyist is to advance things which I don't think in the long run, as John Toohey said, are really not in the long run interests of either state or that sector. And look, I've seen the same, I will say, with commercial lobbyists at times, where they've lobbied for positions that I would say are not in the long-term interest. Personally, that baptism of fire for myself, I was only in my teens at that stage, early teens at that stage, with Exmouth Golf in the 1980s, really had a big impact on me. We can go back further, because there's also the case, a great master's paper by Christensen from Murdoch University, and he actually looks at fights between recreational and commercial lobbies in the southwest in the first half of the 20th century. And funny enough, I could just read it and see a lot of the same parallels. In the end, these were resolved, and this is Christensen's comments, these resolved when they appointed professional science-based management in the post-Second World War period. So they just went on, and typically about lobbies, the recreational lobby would get support by the local publican because he wanted more people to visit, and commercial lobbies would be resisting certain things. Said, well, why are we losing out to all these other people? So this is not a new issue. It does seem to come up on a regular basis every 30 or 40 years. It's unfortunate that we seem to have to learn from the beginning again that you can't solve these sort of problems on a political basis. You actually ramp up the activity that you would actually like to see reduce. And as I said, whether it's the 1930s, whether it's the 1980s, or whether it's today, the same incentives are still there. And that's put the professor hat on. If you have incentives for poor action by lobby groups, is it the government's fault that the lobby groups misbehave, or is the government's fault for setting up the incentive-based system? Focusing on their positions rather than the interests of the state.
I suppose something that's been on the mind of a lot of people, including many people in the commercial sector, is the fact that this demersal ban applies to all fish species that are classified as demersal. So not just the species like dhufish, pink snapper that have been deemed to be at risk, but also species like nannygai or bite redfish, which were deemed to be fine. And many commercial fishermen have said, well, why has fishing for that species been banned when it's sustainable? I think the government's explanation was that there can be some overlap in the habitat.
So the dhufish stocks are at such a low level that even very minor incidental catch would be a concern. It's very different than, say, Renepa stocks in the Kimberley and the Pilbara, especially with this big 3,000 square kilometre effectively reserve. We don't have those 3,000 kilometre reserves of that kind in the southwest, and it's regrettable that although we've had a number in parks put in, usually they've just been made open to recreational fishing as well. So you haven't had, in a commercial fishery we have those reserves, but in actual marine parks we don't have that to the same extent. So incidental catch is a problem and it needs to be managed. I think there's two elements in this. One is that it's difficult to manage and can be expensive, but the government hasn't indicated that expense is a problem here. And difficult to manage, there's a number of writers on WA's fisheries and agriculture, such as Trevor Whittington, in the public domain. There's been defunding of these areas, though the government may dispute that, but effective defunding of these areas in the last 10 years. And it started before the Labor government came into place, I must say. Don't want to suggest this is a party political aspect, because that happened. The rot came in. So when you get a crisis like the shothole borer, a number of your listeners will be aware in WA, shothole borer is an insect that was poisoning a number of trees around Perth. There were very limited resources for the government to act on that. And so I think there are some practical things there for government. The real concern I have here is, where's the incentive to manage it that way if these fisheries are permanently reallocated to the recreational sector? So in a way, the government's got no incentive to do that, because that would actually undermine their objective, not in all fisheries. The Pilbara fisheries not being reallocated that way, and some of the Gascoyne fisheries as well. So, but in West Coast and Perth Metropolitan, they're allocated to recreational fisheries once this policy ends. And the political nature of it is a bit of a giveaway that the ban on recreational fishing stops just before the next election. At this stage, there's no plan set out for future fisheries management. how does this normally happen in fisheries management? Well, I've already mentioned the TUI report, but there have been other reports. Generally, you get a report, you get some form of inquiry as to what went wrong, how to fix it, how to ensure good fisheries management is ongoing. You usually get an independent, well-respected international person to come in and give an overview on the actions the government's taken. They're always a bit circumspect. They are paid by the government, but there's a degree of that independence there. None of that has been proposed here. All I've seen proposed is a new advisory council selected by the government. Now, the problem with any advisory committee just selected by the government working in Western Australia, for a start, they've got to work within the policy guidelines the state government set. We don't know what they're going to be. Are they allowed to consider whether future commercial fishing should be revived? Those sort of issues. So it's looking a bit weak on the future fisheries management side. And now the defence might be, well, it's a crisis, we have to do something. I don't agree in this instance. I think it would be entirely reasonable to say that they will have a review of how we got onto this place and give some good indications of how we could not do it again in the future. And the old thing, if you don't plan to do things differently, you can't be surprised if you repeat what happened. Look, I just say a little bit more about how the science all works too, because I think that'll be interesting to some readers, because it's the science it's based on. So, certainly, large commercial fisheries such as the Pilbara, Trappen, trawl fishery, they have 5 separate tests that are applied when we do these 5-year reviews. So 5 tests to see the degree to which they're sustainable and appropriate. And they're tough reviews, and sometimes the industry comes off second, doesn't come off that well. Sometimes it comes off well. The point is, it leads to specific recommendations on how the fishery needs to improve. The recreational fisheries is harder, and it's actually assessed generally by a 3-year survey of fishes, combined with some independent fishing, where they look at the length and size of the species. And there's statistical stuff you can do. That's quite a bit you can do just knowing length and size if you've already got a good fisheries model. Usually the good fisheries models are generated out of the commercial data, but then you can use that commercial data to assess recreational fishing. How they're going to assess it in the 3 years where there's no fishing at all is a complex question. But presuming they're going to be doing surveys using scientific vessels or some other means to get these length frequency data, because clearly a 3-year survey of recreational fishes isn't going to work for this fishery. So, and it gets difficult because some of these long-lived species do not recruit at the same level each year. Sometimes they have a big burst of recruitment, and other times they have poor levels of recruitment. So you have to do quite a bit of fishing in order to pick up some of these signals. So that's for the future. The problem with the past approach of doing recreational 3-year surveys is you look at your model, but you only really know how much has been caught in the next 3 years once you get that survey, which will the data usually comes about a year after the survey. And so with recreational fishing, you're always working with a big lag. Now, it was one of the Premier's election commitments that he wouldn't move recreational fishers to compulsory reporting. One of the positive things is he's dropped that. I personally am not completely convinced that 100% reporting, and this will be controversial with a number of people in the fishing industry as rec fishers, it goes back to my research in the public right to fish. We should do as little as we can that can generate the data in relation to the public, because the public wants to feel the liberty to go fishing, and that's valuable to them over and above the value of the fish itself. And if we take too much of a bureaucratic approach to recreational fishing, well, we actually literally spoil the fun. It is a recreation. It's meant to be fun fishing. So there's a balancing factors there. But I think going into this saying we are prepared to, I won't say break, but to say take back one of our election commitments, I think was a very necessary step here. And it was just unfortunate, as I said, that was in the election platform in the first place. It's very rare, and that's where I get the concern about the degree to which science is influencing things, because that was a government who's already been in power. This is not an opposition coming in. So they should have known what the situation is for recreational fishing, and yet they made that commitment. And so I applaud them for what they've done, but I also have concerns about the politics of this because of what they did in the past. And so what could they have done then, I think is the next quest. So only a few species are deemed under threat, and as I said, I don't believe that under threat of extinction, certainly for red emperor, snapper, and a few of these other species, was ever really on the cards. Nothing I've seen there suggests that it was given that, like, the red emperor already had a fisheries recovery plan in place. It's not like, we're going to double down fishing next year. They already had a 38% reduction and a recovery plan in place under a memorandum of understanding with the government. But recreation, I said, is hard to manage, and there's no way we could have got around without, I believe, some shutdowns. It would either be very large areas, and usually those targeted by recreationals, whereas the commercials would be allowed to fish with a small level of catch of the species that they're of the most concern. As I said, it's tricky to manage, and I think the government just said, look, we're going to take the simple option. As I said, they'd have more credibility if they didn't use the same opportunity to remove commercial fishing and undertake a number of other aspects of fisheries management which pandered to the Greens. And that's where the problem, most significant problem I have, is because that is what they've done. Now, they may believe they have good reasons for that, but I'm just focusing on what they have done in fact and what messages it sends for the future. Because no one ever cares about everybody's good intentions. They say, what happened? Oh, this fishery got overfished and then it got reallocated 100% to the recreationals. That is what happened. This fishery was running a game consistent with the national standards in relation to endangered species and catch of marine mammals, or both of those you want to keep to minimum. But they were meeting the national requirements for that, and yet they're shut down. So what message does that send to people in commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, and the community at large?
What effect do you think that these restrictions will have on regional communities up and down the coast, like Kalbarri, Augusta, Esperance, Geraldton?
I think that the segments of those communities will be severely affected. You just can't. I mean, if you've got a lease for 3 years, you can't wait 2.5 years for your customers to return. I don't believe everybody's going to want to go. This is demersal catching, so demersal species are fish that mainly live on or near the bottom. You've still got pelagic and semi-pelagic fishing possible, so that's trolling for tailor. It's still going, as far as I understand, will still be allowed. That's going to require that's going to require a lot of enforcement to make sure people aren't just stopping for lunch and then the fish jump into the boat or something like that. So that's quite a bit of work. But the government has announced they're going to try to promote alternative strategies. It's very difficult to predict people's reactions. Are people going to swap? Are they going to focus on other species, these pelagics, or they're just going to stop fishing? It's probably going to be all of the above, but we don't know what proportion. And so some areas might do well. I mean, these are significant, Kalbarri, Geraldton, they're significant regional communities, a lot of other things happening in those communities. So I think the broader community will carry on, but I think it will be very hard for specific groups. And also, I don't want to underestimate, this failure has meant a loss of significant amenity by the hundreds of thousands of Western Australians who fish. And that's why it's not just a failure because I have my history with the commercial fishery, but it's a failure, as I say, to the public right to fish. The public right to fish is based upon the government being, in place of the community, treasuring the resource on our behalf, and that's sort of the logic of it, or the modern logic of it. And yet that's a failure. I mean, this is a significant loss of amenity. There's been very little comment on that loss of amenity and the impact it will have on individuals. I mean, there are a lot of people, for them, going out and fishing is what they do. And then you've got to consider what's going to happen with the other catches. So how much extra pressure is that going to put on the lobster fishery? I'm thinking particularly around Kalbarri and so on. People don't have other opportunities, they'll displace it, or will they just do other things? So they do other things, will they come back to fishing in 2.5 years? I just think all those things will be significant. Just because the human nature is varied, that's why governments using heavy-handedness in policy is not usually a good idea. Human nature is varied, we'll see a range of different responses. But I think for some local communities, it will be the end of part of how they see themselves. Like places like Kalbarri.
So a real loss of identity.
Identity, yeah. I think it's a loss of identity for the individuals as well. People that are sort of semi-retired and see themselves as a recreational fisher, they're out there trolling for tailor, which a great fighting fish for trawling. You're not going to convince me a lovely red emperor over a tailor. Fishing for herring, but we had concerns with herring stocks 10 years ago or so. So there are no easy outcomes here. If you have fishing effort and it moves, then you have to manage that shift of fishing effort as well.
And so the government has seemed to indicate that, these people that are in the demersal commercial fishery, well, they can just move to the pelagic or near shore fish. So could you give us an idea of what exactly would be involved in someone who is currently a demersal commercial fisher moving to pelagics, and is that even really feasible?
I think that's more of loose language by government, because I don't believe they really believe that themselves. Once again, this is a fisheries management principle which has been set in stone since the late 70s, early 1980s. Displaced effort must be managed. You can't just displace effort onto another fishery, whether it's recreational effort or commercial effort. You must manage it, because we have a history in the 50s, 60s and 70s for fisheries become managed and then moving effort to someone else, and they're somewhere else and then somewhere, and eventually you run out of places. But you've really got to manage that displaced effort. But you've got to manage the comeback of recreational effort as well. These are long-lived species. If a dhufish is 12 years old, 2.5-year pause may not be sufficient to achieve the objectives that the government set. And once again, they've said that this will still only lead to recover by 2040, but there's a bit of gap in what happens between 2027 and 2040 at this stage. I hope we will see a lot more from government. I'm not currently convinced that they have the answers. As I said, they've taken a sledgehammer and there's collateral damage, and they just intend to manage that damage as it comes. We've already seen a back down by government, for example, into compensation for commercial fishers. It was going to be on sometime next year. Now the government's announced that they will advance possible act of grace early payments, which would then be deducted, not extra payments, but deducted on from whatever compensation they might get at the end. So we've already seen some shifts as governments trying to manage the fallout from their activities. But I think there's no managing around that fisheries management in WA, from being world leaders in the late 1990s to the early 2000s, is no longer either leader or admired even in Australia. We had the debacle in relation to the government's attempt to effectively nationalise part of the rock lobster fishery. We've got the government using the rights that are held by commercial fishers to transfer effectively rights to recreational fisheries, notwithstanding they actually have plans that say they shouldn't be doing that. Policies to say they shouldn't be doing that. And we've seen the intrusion of direct lobbying of conservation groups as starting to guide fisheries management. So I think that that's going to take a while to come back from. One strike, the rock lobster issue is fine. Second strike does make it seem that WA is no longer competent to manage its fisheries.
So given everything you've said and these valid concerns about the way that this management approach has been taken, what do you think are some alternative approaches that the government could have taken towards this crisis?
Reality is that different fisheries have different risks and different measures that need to be taken. They're quite variable. And you go from WA from a single species fishery, such as Western rock lobster, to tiny little but valuable coral collectors up in the northwest, for collecting coral for aquariums. Very valuable on kilo by kilo when you collect that stuff. But so it's a huge variance. They all need fisheries management is normally done on a basis that's horses for courses. And the use of a big hammer, a big sledgehammer, has meant that that's been lost. And so the normal, typical approach is you use triage, focus on the biggest, riskier problems first. Do not upend systems that are demonstrated to be effective. And let's be clear, the Fisheries Department, or the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, Prime Minister and Fisheries, DPO, yes, Prime Minister, it's a big department. Fisheries has been put into this bigger department, lost its identity. Somehow they've got to manage. I said they have to manage displaced effort anyway. I mean, that's a new task for them. It's not like we've got less fisheries to management. Our job's going to be easier. They still have many great fisheries to manage in WA, such as a prawn fishery in Exmouth and lobster fisheries and a whole range of other great fisheries down to small mandrill crab fisheries and so on. So still a lot of other fisheries in WA. It's not the end of fisheries in WA, but the end of what a lot of people believe is iconic about fisheries. Beautiful, clean, white-fleshed fish for not just, hopefully not fish and chips, have it that way, but there's a lot of other ways these beautiful white fish. Well, that's really going to be very expensive or unavailable for most West Australians. So I would therefore use a more measured approach. I think would have been preferable, and avoid, as I said, playing the game between interest groups and just do it straight back. So if you're contributing as a commercial fisher to this fishery declining, you need to be reduced. It's recreational, you need to be reduced, but not suddenly prefer one group over the other. And it would cast doubt in many commercial fishers' mind in WA, and probably unfairly, where governments ever intended in the last 15 years to do anything but to squeeze them down and kick them out. And if I was a fisher in one of those fisheries, I would probably have that view. I think government's more complex than that. And it's always easy to attribute those motives. That's not my style and not my belief, but I would see how a fisher who's been excluded now from Midwest fisheries completely would be Western Demersal fisheries would feel very much that way, because they probably kept on. There've been further reductions, try to keep in there, keep the business running, all of that, and now it's gone. So, you just gotta, it's fisheries management. It's not rocket science in the sense that Australia has been a leader in fisheries management and has been very good at it generally. As I said earlier in my comments about the Exmouth prawn fishery in the 1980s, every now and then nature throws you a curveball. Now, it's not a matter of who's at fault. The answer is we need to reduce effort by humans. And that's the other thing that gets lost in this. It really doesn't matter who's at fault. And I don't think it helps to say recreations are more at fault than commercials more at fault than recreationals. My view is forward-looking. Okay, what are you doing with the future rights? Rather than, because I don't think at fault is helpful, because the science changes all the time. And it's like no one misled someone on the science frequently. People may feel misled. It's just that they did more research, and the nature of science, they've decided after some consideration that the species is more vulnerable to fishing pressure. That doesn't apply to jewfish. Let's be clear. This has been known for a very long time. As I said, I've made that personal choice some time ago not to eat order jewfish. Every now and then you find it served to yourself when you don't order it. I mean, I'm not trying to resuscitate it by putting the fillet back in the ocean or something like that, but making a personal choice. And I think that's why I've always supported Marine Stewardship Council. And there's a lot of great MSC fisheries lobsters, one of them Exmouth Gulf, Shark Bay prawn, and a range in WA, because what it does is it gives the consumer more power to make informed decisions as to what they should be eating, rather than just relying upon government with all of its vagaries of the politics, and those vagaries have not worked to the benefit of the amenity of West Australians.
Given the situation that we're in and the fact that the government's taken this very blunt force approach in the form of punitive regulations, do you think that there's a room perhaps for technology like hatchery, fish stocking, or artificial reefs to help alleviate this problem?
So I think these technologies have been used around the world at different times, different places, not altogether successfully. Fish stocking in particular is not a general cure. It is technically possible in some places at some times, and generally for high-value, fast-growing and short-lived species. So highly productive, fast-growing, and they're valuable, so it's worth the effort, such as prawns and scallops. We're talking about dhufish here that are not going to recover to 2040. I mean, it's difficult to conceive how a research program that would demonstrate whether fish stocking is working or not would be capable of ever proving anything. Now, it's the sort of thing that at times governments where there has been a total collapse have decided to do it anyway, usually as part of, I think it's trying to convince the community that they really do take this seriously, and they even things that are unlikely to benefit the future they're prepared to look at. And so we may see some of that, but I don't think it's practical because the species we want to look at are the long-lived species, and they're the ones that are hard to do and they're hard to breed, and then you have to wait for them to grow out, usually for 1 or 2 years before you can even put them back in the ocean. Otherwise you just get mowed down by everything. And then you've got to actually catch a lot of them to see whether the genetic signature that you, because these days you put a genetic signature in the fish, and so you can catch them later and find out whether they came from that group. You're still not going to know whether they outcompeted other red emperor in that group, and so they actually contributed to any increase, or just that they outcompeted some of those, and so not much has changed. There are ways of getting around that, and some interesting stuff's being done, especially with the ability to track these genetic signatures now. But I don't see that as relevant for this particular game. Where they're useful, look, there's some stocking in the Swan River where you get everything dies because of environmental collapse. Yeah, even they have not shown to be particularly effective, as far as I understand. They may, but once again, they may be in specific circumstances, but it's really not. It's not an appropriate tool for use here. And unfortunately, artificial reefs are also a solution looking for a problem here, because focusing on the west coast and metropolitan fishes, we have very extensive offshore reefs, as all recreational fishers know. You got to avoid them. And I've seen no indication that those reefs are in any decline. These aren't tropical reefs. They're not coral. There's some coralline reefs, but they don't appear to be in decline. And for example, the rock lobster fishery depends on those reefs significantly. That's still very healthy. So there not being a lack of suitable reefs in WA, creating artificial reefs is unlikely to be any impact. As I said, one thing, this is stuff if there's depletion at a very local scale. And I will say that some species do need, in particular, shallow inshore areas, often with seagrass to breed. And particularly I know that that's a case for King George whiting in Cockburn Sound, which, now my background's 15, 20 years old here, but certainly that was identified back in the early 2000s as the only breeding stock of King George whiting on the west coast, or stock on the south coast. And that's in Cockburn Sound, and that's an environment very significantly modified by man, with a lot of industry and so on. So those sort of places, I think this does have validity and can be useful, because the ecosystem has been significantly modified by us. You know that they recruit from there, so you've already got the science saying where you're going to do it. When you do that, and you know it's probably a choke point for recruitment of the species. So you've got all of those ducks lined up in a row. I think it's useful. And I have to say, my understanding is there's some interesting work on the restoration of Cockburn Sound in the works, and hopefully we'll see that being announced, not by me, by the way, but by other people. You know, what you hear in policy, academic and industry circles, that I'm hoping that we'll see something of that in the near future, because it's not all negative here. You know, there are positives. Yes, we have stopped fishing. The fish stocks will recover, or they won't recover. It's not going to be because of overfishing, but unfortunately, significance has been damaged, both to people's livelihoods, to the people's lifestyles, and also general respect for fisheries management in Western Australia, because the incentives are not out of whack, even though that's been government policy for the last 20 years to bring those incentives into line, commercial, recreation and conservation. So we've moved out from there. Where we go next will depend what the government can do. That big announcement before Christmas, everyone's on holidays in the public sector, not everyone, but a lot of people on holidays. We don't normally get a lot of great policy development in this period. In fact, I'm minded of Colin Barnett when he announced the shark drum lines off Western Australia. He did the same thing. It's like announced it and went on holiday, as I recall. And the poor Fisheries Minister, who'd only just been appointed, ended up answering all the queries. Now, both the Minister and the Premier are not in a similar case as that, but it is moving into that Christmas period, and that is going to be difficult. And I point out too that the staff of DPIRD, Department of Industry and whatever, the staff of the relevant government department, which even people internally, it's still called Fisheries Department, and the Rex do as well, called the Fisheries Department. It's not just me with name phobia as to the latest government acronym. They've got other jobs to do. It's not the only fisheries in the state. Our Marine Stewardship Council Fisheries, a lot of work has to be done every year to re-up their certification because it's independent gold standard certification. So that's still, there's a lot of people still got a lot of work to do. Plus, just because no one's fishing in the fishery, that means they have to come up with completely new ways to, not completely, substantively new ways to sample and sample effectively. They're going to have to be on the ground running at least by March, April, otherwise they will have lost 4 or 5 months of data. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There may well be plans in place for that, but I can't, they're not in the public domain that I've seen.
It's interesting that you brought up the shark drumline program that was brought in by Premier Barnett, which I remember quite vividly. It was quite controversial at the time. In 2007, the commercial shark fishery in Western Australia had significant restrictions brought in on it. We're seeing 2 decades after these restrictions were brought into place. What effect do you think that this has had on the populations of demersal fish, if any?
We've actually had shark fisheries up and down the coast. That was just one of the remaining ones that's left. The result of fishing is to reduce the populations of fish. In fact, when I was dealing on the Demersal Management Council, Major of Coburn Sound, one of the well-meaning people, I think in the conservation group, wanted the policy to be the stock of snapper to be the same as it would have been if it was a virgin stock. And I said, well, that can't be done. Otherwise, you can't fish snapper because the whole point of it is to reduce the population, i.e. eat it. But you want to reduce the population only to a sustainable level, taking into account relevant risk factors. So that's the difference between fishing and not fishing. So there are more sharks out there. They will eat more fish. A whole question of depredation has often occurred about what happens when sharks take fish from recreational fishers or seen by commercial fishers. All of that sort of stuff is very difficult to model, and we're talking about multiple shark species and it's a big state. So sometimes these questions are really hard only because it's a big state, and some sharks are local, some range broadly, some range internationally. But I can tell you one thing that recreational and commercial fishers 100% agree, that sharks are eating a lot of their fish. So that's about the only thing at the moment I think they both definitely agree on, but that is the one thing they agree on. Now I'm veering off myself here of the scientific basis, and that's because it's a very complicated question, because what you're asking about is the populations of things when not fishing, so generally you have a limited information base. One of the big advantages of fishing is you get carcasses, you get reports, you get statistics. If you're not fishing them, then all we've got to go with is some other forms, and there are other forms. Udover Way, amongst others, marine area have been done a lot of really good work on light traps and so on to assess shark populations. So there are ways around this, but they don't really answer that question you've said. You've got an idea what the shark population is, but to the degree which they are impeding or not the growth of the fish stocks is a very hard thing to ask. You think about the life cycle of some of these fish. When they're small, the sharks might be eating the predators of the juveniles, and when they get big, the sharks are competing with us for the adults. So are they helping or are they hindering? Well, maybe at different times of the life cycle, they're doing different things. It depends on what's the choke point for that species. And if the choke point is something that the sharks are targeting, then they'll be hindering it. But these are very difficult questions to ask. I think humility is always the best approach to fisheries management, because we don't manage fish. We manage people's interactions with fish. And so that means we have a very limited perspective on the marine environment. Now, I really support more broader base marine science research. I mentioned UWA, there's WA Marine Sciences Institute, I think WAMSI. There's some good groups in WA focusing on some of those broader issues. But it's very little. It's I wouldn't say it's a drop in the ocean, because it's a really bad metaphor given what we're talking about. But I would say that the more we have that more general research, the better we're going to be able to manage fisheries generally as well. Because these big questions about, will this stock ever recover? Are sharks interfering with the recovery? And like, what if dhufish are now permanently at 10 to 20% of their original biomass? Does that mean that we forever close the fishery, even though we're unlikely to cause dhufish to go extinct, but we're also hindering their recovery in epochal terms, in terms of like 100 years, 200 years? These are questions that are really difficult for fisheries management to answer. And they require a lot more thought about the marine environment and big trends and a warming ocean. Off Western Australia, we haven't gone into some of those trends. We're just focusing on what we can do about people. But that is also when stocks collapse or stocks reduce, you have to reduce effort. There's no magical way of doing it without reducing effort. But the question you asked about other species, are there ways of very highly targeted effort? I think the answer is yes. But once again, it's disappointing that not only is it a 2.5-year ban, that the possibility of doing that for commercial species for some of these fisheries in the announcement have been wiped out by saying it will be recreation-only fisheries in the future.
Well, Dr. Kailis, thank you so much for joining us to speak about this issue. Hopefully, when this gets published, people will take on board your nuanced take on this issue, and maybe we'll see some better management decisions going forward, especially if people make some more noise about it.
Look, I'm still hopeful. Once again, on my own experience in Exmouth Gulf in the early 1980s, the government's initial response was unreasonably harsh because, as I said, the impact on the viability of any company when you go out and say that its main income earner is cancelled. I'm hoping that there will be flexibility. Okay, the big press releases have been made, the government's made its big positions and big decisions, and that they can work with commercial and recreational fishers and say, okay, what are the best ways that we can still preserve the gains we intend to have and the gains that must be made, while still providing greater amenity to West Australians, and whether it's consumers of fish and they get left out of this discussion. When we say we take it from commercial fishers, give to the recreations, this is fresh fish in WA. We're taking it from the mouths of people in restaurants and putting into the catches of recreational fishers. They may have $1 million boat, they may have a little tinny, but they're getting the benefit of that. And if I want to eat fish in a restaurant, then we don't. And I look forward, if I last long enough, to getting Taste of Dhufish in 2040 when the stock's recovered.
Dr. Kailis, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, John.